Thank you very much. So, well, Anka has already introduced myself. I work as a communication strategist at the European Commission. And indeed, what today I would like to focus on is the topic of crisis communication and its relation with terminology in the domain of migration. Just a few words first about when I started to link institutional communication with terminology. This happened in 2013 when I started indeed the PhD study called Migration in Translation. I've also recently published an extracted article on this on the journal Terminology. And basically my decision a few years ago was to apply all the knowledge I acquired during the PhD to communication. And so what I try to do, and I will explain today, is to really put terminology and all the theories that stand behind it in my communication work every day, especially in crisis situations like migration, but also the recent situation we had in Afghanistan. So with all the refugees coming to Europe, and as Patrick said before, also COVID. So let's say that it was all these situations were really, really critical, but also useful to reflect on communication. So I would like to start to speak about communication itself. So what do we mean by communication? And I do this because sometimes there are some misunderstandings about what communication is. So the academic field of reference is communication studies or applied communication studies. And communication derives from the Latin word communicationem, communicare, which means to share, to put together for the community. So communication is different from information. So while information is giving out, communication is more about getting through. So communication is a process that consists in the transmission of ideas, information, emotions, and knowledge by using words, images, symbols. There are different types of communication through appropriate channels that we have to choose to reach a specific type of audience. What you see here is one of the models that is used in applied communication as a reference, which is Jacobson's model, where you see that, of course, in the process of communication, there is a sender, there is a receiver, but there is also a context. So when it comes to, for instance, terminology, you need to be really, really careful with what you choose regarding the context where you are. Now passing from communication to institutional communication, what we mean by this is the set of strategies that are used by an institution to inform and communicate directly and unambiguously with citizens in a multilingual context such as the European Union. Of course, in this context, English is not the only option, of course, but whenever we have to publish a communication, it must be in all the official languages of the EU. So it becomes even more challenging. And that is why, of course, we have special tools like IATE terminology database. When it comes to your communication, so a so-called communication strategy, there are four, let's say, pillars that we have to keep in mind. So the first one is the objectives we have when we communicate. So what do we want to achieve with our communication? Then the target audiences. So to whom are we speaking with? The messages. So which messages should I feature in all my products? And finally, and this is very important and where I would like to draw the attention, the tone of voice. It is really the way it is defined inside a communication strategy, which is normally a document that is used whenever a communication has to be published and contains the words, the terms that we have to use in the products. So now, what do we mean by crisis communication? So of course, this is linked with what I showed you in the previous slide. So crisis communication is the set of strategies that are used to effectively respond to a crisis situation. The difference between a normal situation and a crisis situation is that when a crisis occurs, there is no time. So a proactive and detailed communication is critical. When it comes to a crisis situation in communication, what you need first is a communication plan, which compared with a communication strategy contains the timing, so when you're going to do what, where you detail the objectives, the target audiences, the messages, but you also have to include the tone of voice and a glossary of terms relevant to the crisis, to ensure that the language used in all communications remains consistent. Of course, this is a challenge, and I would say that based on my recent experiences, it's not always the case. So it's not always something that has a certain success. So the first message I would like to send today is that what I've seen so far is that terminology is really everywhere. And just to mention some of the challenges that are faced every day in EU institutions, of course, you have to face 3 types of lexicons in your everyday communication, because there is the specific one, just to give you an example taken from the legislative text, so that you have to keep. But there is also the media lexicon. The media have sometimes no laws, so they have to work very quickly, and sometimes they make mistakes. But we have to take into consideration the way they speak with their target audiences that are the ones we want to reach. And also there is the general lexicon. So we have to, in a way, be aware of all the 3, the difference between these 3 types of lexicon. But if there are no terminologists, then it becomes a problem. That is why in this slide I put terminology is indeed everywhere, but not terminologists. And now I would like to link, let's say, this message, this concept with the results of the study I conducted a few years ago in the domain of migration, where, of course, migration represents a crisis situation. And just to give you a timing reference, it broke out in 2015. So we consider the beginning of the migration crisis 2015. It is, of course, still a topic at the forefront of media and political attention. There is an overflow of new terminology surrounding this subject. It involves a policy of classifications on an institutional, media and popular level. And of course, since it comes and it regards the whole European Union, we need to translate it in all the EU languages, so it becomes even more challenging. So according to this study, Migration in Translation, what I have observed is that between 1990 and 2012, there was a considerable number of new terms coined in institutional text. And of course, this contributed to representing migrants in a more broader way, which was on the one hand fragmented and organized into different categories, but also contributed on overcoming a simplified representation of migrants in EU institutions. However, what I've also noticed was that this fragmentation caused further confusion when it comes to who are migrants, who are refugees, who are asylum seekers, and created fuzziness affecting the representation of migrants as well. So just to give you further details, for example, the term refugee went through a determinologization process, meaning that it went from a specialized meaning to a more general one, because when we refer to these people fleeing their country for different reasons as migrants, we put them under the same umbrella term, but this umbrella term doesn't have a legal meaning. So sometimes one of the strategies was to refer to them as refugees, so that it would be clear that these people would need then legal protection in the country where they would arrive. What I would like to draw your attention to is that since 2015, there was an increase in the use of the words people, and in particular I've observed in the latest press releases about the Afghan crisis the word human beings. So it has become a strategy in the institutional text to use these words in order to underline that these people who are fleeing their countries are human beings and cannot only be referred to as refugees, as migrants. So this is indeed a political choice. So the conclusion of the study was that, of course, debating over terminology in the context of migration is not only a question of political and institutional correctness, but it has real implications for migrants themselves. And the problems then of EU communicators are that terminology is not really well known. So there is a lack of terminological awareness that, well, in my experience, I try to overcome every day. But of course, it is not easy because probably this awareness should start well before the people start working. So it means that sometimes we encounter linguistic confusion, there are misunderstandings in text and communications. So one of the ideas and one of the things I would like to invite you today to reflect on is that probably terminology should start to be part of university programs in communication sciences. Sometimes probably it is the case, but it is not as broad as probably it should be, as well as in journalism and EU trainings. And just to name a few of the concepts I frequently use in my work, I bring as an example the semiotic triangle. I try to explain that terms and words are labels, and you cannot just say that you think that this word fits better the purpose, because you need to give a justification, as well as term frequency and, of course, the use of glossaries. About the use of glossaries, the only risk is that when it comes to crisis communication, you do not have time. So that is why I think, and I link with what Patrick and Sharon have shared with us today, the key, I think, is the use of trainings. So I hope I've passed the main messages to you today. So I hope we will stay in touch. I leave the links to contact me in case you want to. And thanks a lot again for inviting me today.